The woman at the edge of Pyramid City, Nevada, collapsed against the fence post at dawn, her hands bleeding through the cotton gloves she wore to hide the cracks in her skin. And for the first time in her 22 years, Adelaide Lancaster wondered if she might actually die from exhaustion before the sun climbed over the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was 1877, and the silver boom had transformed this desert settlement into a place where fortunes rose and fell with the shifting sands. Adelaide had arrived 3 years ago with her father, full of hope and determination. Now she stood alone, bound by debts she hadn't incurred and promises she never made. Her father had died 18 months past, leaving her with a boarding house that leaked, a mortgage that strangled, and a reputation as the hardest working woman in all of Nevada territory. She pushed herself upright, ignoring the protest in her lower back. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and copper. 6 boarders needed breakfast. The linens from yesterday still waited in the basin. Mrs. Chen's order of preserves needed delivering before noon. The fence required mending. The roof over the back room had started dripping again during last week's rare rainstorm. Adelaide's stomach growled, reminding her she'd forgotten supper again. She couldn't remember the last full meal she'd eaten. There was always something more pressing than food, more urgent than sleep. Her mirror had stopped lying to her months ago. The woman who stared back had hollows under her eyes deep enough to hold shadows, cheekbones that jutted sharp against pale skin, and lips cracked from dehydration and neglect. "Miss Lancaster," the shrill voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson, her most demanding boarder. "The water in my basin is cold." Adelaide closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength from somewhere deep inside, a well that surely must run dry soon. "Coming, Mrs. Patterson." The day unfolded like all the others. Adelaide hauled water, scrubbed floors, kneaded bread, stirred pots, mended tears in fabric and in the house itself. Her hands moved with mechanical efficiency, performing tasks her body had memorized through endless repetition. She didn't stop to drink water until the afternoon sun had climbed high enough to turn the boarding house into an oven. Even then, she only allowed herself 3 quick swallows before returning to the laundry. The other women in Pyramid City had stopped inviting her to socials. She had declined too many times, always with work as her excuse. It wasn't an excuse. It was simply the truth. If she stopped moving, everything would collapse. The boarding house would fail. She would lose the only thing her father had left her. She would end up like so many other women in mining towns, with options that made her stomach turn and her heart ache. So Adelaide worked, dawn to dusk, and often long after dark. She worked until her fingers bled and her vision blurred. She worked through headaches and muscle cramps, and a bone-deep weariness that had become as familiar as her own name. Rest was not something she could afford. Rest was for people who had the luxury of choice. The sun had started its descent toward the western mountains when Adelaide noticed the man watching her from across the street. He stood with the stillness of someone comfortable in his own skin, broad-shouldered and solid as the mountains themselves. Dark hair fell past his collar, and even from this distance, she could see the sun had bronzed his skin to the color of saddle leather. He wore buckskins and a hat that had seen better days, and something about the way he held himself spoke of wild places and solitary trails. Adelaide looked away quickly, focusing on the fence post she was attempting to repair. Strange men were common enough in a mining town, and she had learned long ago not to invite attention. She hammered the nail with perhaps more force than necessary, driving it deep into the weathered wood. "You're going to split that post if you keep hitting it like you're mad at it." The voice was deep, rough around the edges like stones tumbling in a creek bed. Adelaide spun, hammer raised defensively. The man had crossed the street without her noticing, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for someone his size. Up close, he was even more imposing. Well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt and arms corded with muscle that spoke of hard labor and harder living. His face was angular, all strong lines and sharp edges, softened only slightly by eyes the color of a winter sky. "I can manage my own fence, sir," Adelaide said, proud that her voice didn't shake despite her racing heart. "Didn't say you couldn't." He tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her want to step back. "Said you're going to split the wood. There's a difference." "I don't need help," was an offering, but he didn't move away. Instead, he pulled out a canteen and held it toward her. "You need water, though. You look about ready to keel over." "I'm fine." "You're dehydrated. Probably haven't eaten since yesterday if I'm reading the signs right. And you're favoring your left side, which means your back is giving you trouble." He shook the canteen slightly. "Drink." Something in his tone, not quite commanding but utterly certain, made Adelaide reach for the canteen before she could think better of it. The water was cool and clean, tasting faintly of metal. She allowed herself 4 swallows before forcing herself to stop and hand it back. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne Garrett." He took the canteen, his fingers brushing hers briefly. His hands were massive, scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who had built and fought and survived. "I'm looking for a room. Heard you run the boarding house." Adelaide's business instincts warred with her exhaustion. She needed the money a new boarder would bring, but she also needed to finish the fence, prepare supper, scrub the front steps, and patch the tear in Mr. Morrison's curtain. Adding another person to her workload might be the thing that finally broke her. "I have 1 room available," she heard herself say, money one as it always did. $3 a week includes breakfast and supper, laundry is extra. Fair enough. Thorne's eyes hadn't left her face. "When's the last time you sat down?" The question was so unexpected that Adelaide blinked. "I don't see how that's your concern, Mr. Garrett." "It's not. I'm just curious if you even remember." She didn't. Adelaide turned back to the fence, dismissing him. "The room is at the back of the house, second door on the left. I'll show you up after I finish this. I can find it myself." But still he didn't leave. Adelaide could feel his presence like heat from a stove, radiating warmth and something else she couldn't quite name. When she finally glanced back, he was gone, moved with that same unnerving silence. Adelaide finished the fence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her hands were shaking by the time she set down the hammer. The day's work pressed against her like a physical weight, and she still had supper to prepare. She forced her legs to carry her toward the kitchen, each step requiring conscious thought. Thorne Garrett sat at the long kitchen table, and he wasn't alone. Somehow, he had managed to get a fire going in the stove, and something that smelled like heaven bubbled in her largest pot. Biscuits sat cooling on a cloth, golden and perfect. Coffee steamed in the pot she kept for special occasions. "What are you doing?" The words came out sharper than Adelaide intended. "Cooking supper." Thorne didn't look up from the vegetables he was chopping with practiced efficiency. "Figured you could use the help." "I didn't ask for help. I don't need help." But even as she said it, her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. Thorne's mouth quirked at the corner, not quite a smile. "Course not. Consider it payment for the room then. I like to cook. Relaxes me." Adelaide wanted to argue, wanted to reclaim her kitchen and her pride, but the smell of that stew had weakened her resolve. She sank into one of the chairs before her legs could give out entirely. "You can't cook for all the boarders. That wasn't part of the arrangement." "Already did." "Biscuits are done. Stew will be ready in 10 minutes." He finally looked at her, and something in his expression made her throat tight. It wasn't pity exactly, but a kind of understanding that felt almost worse. "When you're done eating, you're going to bed. I have work to do. Mr. Morrison's curtain needs mending, and the front steps can wait until tomorrow." Thorne's voice was firm. "You're running yourself into the ground, Miss Lancaster. You don't know anything about me or my circumstances." Adelaide pushed herself back to her feet, swaying slightly. "I appreciate the meal, Mr. Garrett, but I don't need you or anyone else telling me how to manage my life." She made it 3 steps before her vision tunneled, and her knees buckled. Strong arms caught her before she hit the floor, and Adelaide found herself pressed against a chest as solid as the mountains themselves. Thorne lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against him. "Put me down." But the words came out weak, unconvincing even to her own ears. "No." He carried her through the boarding house, navigating the narrow hallways with surprising grace for a man his size. "Which room is yours?" I said. "Put me down." And I said no. "Your room, Miss Lancaster." Adelaide knew she should fight harder, should insist on her independence and capability. But the warmth of his body and the solid strength of his arms had done something to her defenses. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt safe, protected. The sensation was so foreign, so unexpected that it brought tears to her eyes. "First floor," she whispered. "The small room behind the kitchen." Her room was barely large enough for the narrow bed and battered dresser it contained. Adelaide had given all the good rooms to paying boarders, keeping only this cramped space for herself. Thorne set her down on the bed with surprising gentleness, his hand steadying her shoulders until he was certain she wouldn't topple over. "You're going to eat the stew I bring you," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Then you're going to sleep. I'll handle supper for the boarders and clean up after." "You can't." "I can and I will. We'll discuss terms tomorrow after you've had some rest." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her. "Rest isn't a sin, Miss Lancaster, despite what you seem to think." Then he was gone, and Adelaide was alone with her exhaustion and the echo of his words. Rest isn't a sin, but it felt like one. Every moment she wasn't working was a moment she was failing, losing ground in a battle she couldn't afford to lose. How could she explain that to a stranger, even one with kind eyes and gentle hands? The stew arrived minutes later, carried by Thorne along with 2 biscuits and a cup of coffee. He set them on the small table beside her bed and stood there, arms crossed, until she picked up the spoon. The first bite was revelation. Tender meat, perfectly seasoned vegetables, a broth rich enough to make her want to weep. Adelaide hadn't realized how hungry she was until she started eating. She finished the entire bowl and both biscuits while Thorne watched with satisfaction. "Better," he said, collecting the empty dishes. "Now sleep." Adelaide wanted to protest, to assert her control over her own life and schedule, but her body had other ideas. The moment her head touched the pillow, darkness rose up to claim her. Her last conscious thought was of winter sky eyes and a voice that said rest wasn't a sin. She woke to sunlight streaming through her small window and the smell of coffee brewing. Adelaide sat up with a gasp, panic flooding through her. The sun was well up. She had slept through dawn. The boarders needed breakfast. The washing needed doing. How could she have been so irresponsible? She scrambled out of bed, still wearing yesterday's dress, and rushed into the kitchen. Then stopped, frozen by confusion. The kitchen was spotless. Breakfast dishes were being washed by Mr. Morrison, who looked far too cheerful for a man performing chores. The other boarders sat around the table, chatting amiably, their plates empty of what looked like it had been eggs and bacon. Thorne stood at the stove, flipping flapjacks with casual expertise. "Good morning, Miss Lancaster," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "Mr. Garrett has been telling us about his time in the mountains. Fascinating stories." Adelaide's mouth opened and closed without sound. Thorne glanced over his shoulder and she saw amusement dancing in his eyes. "Morning. Your flapjacks are staying warm in the oven. Coffee's fresh." "What is happening?" Adelaide managed to ask. "Breakfast," Thorne said mildly. "Like happens every morning. I'm supposed to make breakfast." "You were sleeping, so I made breakfast instead." He slid the last flapjack onto a plate and turned to face her fully, wiping his hands on a towel. "The world didn't end. Nobody starved. In fact, I'd say everyone looks pretty satisfied." Mrs. Patterson nodded enthusiastically. "Best bacon I've had in months, dear. You should let Mr. Garrett help more often." Adelaide felt unmoored, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. This was her boarding house, her responsibility, her burden to bear. Having someone else shoulder it, even for a single morning, felt wrong on a fundamental level. But looking at her boarders' happy faces, at the clean kitchen and full stomachs, she couldn't deny the evidence before her eyes. "I need to speak with you," she said to Thorne, her voice tight. "In private." He followed her out to the small back porch, closing the door behind them. The morning air was already warming, promising another hot Nevada day. Adelaide turned to face him, arms crossed defensively. "I appreciate what you did, but you can't just take over my responsibilities." "Why not?" The simple question threw her off balance. "Because this is my boarding house. My father left it to me, and it's my job to run it. Running it doesn't mean killing yourself doing it." Thorne leaned against the porch railing, the wood creaking slightly under his weight. "How long since you had a full night's sleep? That's none of your business. How long since you ate 3 full meals in a day? How long since you took even an hour for yourself?" His eyes held hers, unflinching. "You're working yourself to death, Adelaide. Anyone with eyes can see it." Hearing her given name on his lips sent a strange flutter through her chest. "You don't understand. If I don't work this hard, I'll lose everything. The mortgage payments are barely getting made. I have debts my father left behind. If I slip even a little, it all comes crashing down. And if you collapse from exhaustion, what happens then?" Adelaide had no answer for that. It was a possibility she didn't let herself consider, because considering it meant acknowledging her own limitations. She looked away, focusing on the distant mountains rather than the understanding in Thorne's expression. "I survived 5 winters in the high country," Thorne said quietly. "Built a cabin with my own hands, trapped and hunted my own food, made it through snowstorms that would have killed a weaker man. You know what I learned up there?" "What?" Adelaide asked despite herself. "That even the strongest person has limits. That rest isn't weakness, it's survival. The animals know it. They sleep through winter, conserve their strength for when it matters. But humans, we get it in our heads that we have to go until we break." He pushed off from the railing, moving closer. "You're about to break, Adelaide, and I don't want to watch that happen." "Why do you care?" The question burst out of her, raw and genuine. "You don't know me. You arrived yesterday. Why does any of this matter to you?" Thorne was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. "Maybe because I've been where you are. Not the same circumstances, but the same desperate place where you think rest means failure. Took me nearly dying in a blizzard to learn different. Figured maybe I could save you some suffering if you'd let me." Something in Adelaide's chest cracked, just a hairline fracture in the armor she had built around herself. "I can't afford help. I can barely afford to keep this place running. I'm not asking for money. I'm asking you to let me share the load." Thorne's hand rose, hesitated, then gently touched her shoulder. The warmth of his palm seeped through the thin fabric of her dress. "I can cook, mend, fix things. I'm good with my hands. In exchange for room and board, I'll help you with the work. That's not a fair trade. You'd be doing far more work than a room is worth. Let me worry about what's fair." His thumb brushed against her collarbone, a touch so light she might have imagined it. "What do you say, Adelaide? Will you let me help?" She should say no, should maintain her independence and her pride. Should keep carrying this burden alone because that was what she had always done. But Adelaide was so tired, tired in her bones, tired in her soul. And the thought of not having to do everything alone, even for a little while, was tempting beyond measure. "1 week," she heard herself say. "We'll try it for 1 week. If it doesn't work out, we go back to the regular arrangement." Thorne's smile transformed his face, softening the hard edges and revealing a warmth that made Adelaide's heart skip. 1 week. That's all I'm asking." The pattern of Adelaide's days began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. Thorne rose before dawn as she did, and together they prepared breakfast for the boarders. He moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, and Adelaide found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way his forearms flexed as he kneaded bread dough. The concentration on his face as he flipped eggs without breaking the yolks. The unconscious grace of a man who had spent years doing for himself. On the third morning, she caught herself smiling at something he said and immediately looked away, confused by her own reaction. Thorne Garrett was a temporary fixture in her life, a strange mountain man who would eventually get restless and move on. She couldn't afford to think of him as anything more than temporary help, but he made it difficult to maintain that distance. After breakfast, he would tackle the heavy chores without being asked. He repaired the leak in the back room roof, replacing shingles with steady competence. He fixed the wobbly step on the front porch that Adelaide had been meaning to address for months. He even managed to repair her father's old wagon, which had sat broken and forgotten in the small barn out back. "You don't have to do all this," Adelaide said, watching him work on the wagon's axle. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and she had actually sat down for the first time in recent memory, a glass of lemonade in her hands. "I know." Thorne didn't look up from his work. "Want to, though?" Why not?" He tightened a bolt, muscles shifting beneath his shirt. "Feels good to fix things, make them work right again." Adelaide sipped her lemonade, studying him. "Where did you learn all this? The cooking, the carpentry, all of it. Necessity, mostly. When you're alone in the mountains, you either learn to do everything yourself or you don't survive." Thorne sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "My father taught me some before he passed. The rest I picked up along the way." "How long were you in the mountains?" 5 years. Went up after the war, needed someplace quiet to sort myself out." His expression grew distant, shadowed by memories Adelaide could only guess at. "Found peace up there eventually, but peace can turn into loneliness if you're not careful. Figured it was time to be around people again." "Why Pyramid City?" Thorne's eyes met hers, and something in their depths made her breath catch. "Heard about a silver boom. Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about. Then I saw a woman about to collapse from working herself to death, and I figured maybe I ended up here for a reason." Adelaide's cheeks warmed. "I wasn't about to collapse. You were swaying on your feet, Adelaide. If I hadn't caught you, you would have hit the ground hard." He stood, crossing the distance between them. "You're doing better now, though. Got some color back in your face, not looking quite so much like a ghost." "That's a terrible thing to say to a lady." "Good thing I'm not much for pretty words then." But his smile took any sting from the statement. "You are looking better, though. Truth, not flattery." Adelaide found herself smiling back, something that happened more and more around Thorne. "I feel better. I won't admit it to anyone else, but you were right. I was running myself into the ground. Admitting you have limits doesn't make you weak, makes you smart." Thorne's hand came up, and this time he didn't hesitate before tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, rough and warm. "You're allowed to be human, you know. Allowed to need help, need rest, need someone to care about you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning Adelaide wasn't sure she was ready to examine. Her heart was pounding, and she couldn't blame it on exhaustion this time. Thorne was standing so close she could see the individual whiskers on his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the flecks of darker blue in his winter sky eyes. "Thorne," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for. He seemed to understand anyway. His hand cupped her cheek fully, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Tell me to stop if you want me to stop." Adelaide couldn't have told him to stop if her life depended on it. When Thorne's lips met hers, gentle and questioning, she felt something inside her that had been locked away for years finally break free. The kiss was soft at first, almost tentative, as if he was afraid she might shatter. But when Adelaide pressed closer, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, Thorne deepened the kiss with a hunger that matched her own. She had never been kissed like this, with such focused intensity, as if she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Thorne's arms came around her, pulling her against him, and Adelaide melted into his strength. For once, she wasn't thinking about work or responsibilities or the 100 things that needed doing. There was only this moment, this man, and the dizzying realization that somewhere in the past few days, she had started falling for him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thorne rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I saw you. You saw me covered in dust and about to pass out. I saw the strongest woman I'd ever met, too stubborn to admit she needed help." His arms tightened around her. "Still the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, dirt and all." Adelaide laughed, the sound surprising her. When was the last time she had laughed like that, genuine and unburdened? "You're a terrible liar, Thorne Garrett." "Not lying." He pulled back just enough to look at her properly. "You want to know what I really saw that first day? I saw a woman who would rather die than give up. Who carried weight that would break most men without complaint. Who worked until her hands bled because she was that determined to keep her promises." His thumb traced her lower lip. "That's the kind of strength that makes a man pay attention, the kind of beauty that goes bone deep." Tears pricked at Adelaide's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back furiously, but not before Thorne saw. His expression softened impossibly further, and he gathered her close again, tucking her head beneath his chin. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "You can rest now. I've got you." And for the first time since her father died, Adelaide let herself believe that might be true. The week passed too quickly. Adelaide found herself waking each morning with anticipation rather than dread, knowing Thorne would be in the kitchen with coffee already brewing. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side, their movements synchronized in the way of people who understood each other without needing words. He was always there, a solid presence at her back, ready to lift the heavy loads or reach the high shelves or simply offer a smile when the work got tedious. The boarders noticed the change in Adelaide. Mrs. Patterson commented on her improved appearance. Mr. Morrison thanked her for finally fixing his curtain, which Thorne had mended one evening while Adelaide read aloud from a book of poetry. Even the gruff Mr. Chen, who rarely spoke to anyone, nodded approvingly when he saw Adelaide sitting on the porch one afternoon, actually taking a break. But it was the evenings Adelaide treasured most. After the boarders had retired and the day's work was finished, she and Thorne would sit together on the back porch, watching the stars emerge over the desert. He would tell her stories about his time in the mountains, about encounters with bears and wolves, about winters so harsh the snow reached the roof of his cabin. She would share memories of her father, of the journey west, of her dreams for the boarding house. "I used to think if I just worked hard enough, I could make everything perfect," Adelaide said one night, her head resting against Thorne's shoulder. "That if I pushed myself harder, I could somehow earn the right to keep this place." "You don't have to earn the right to something that's already yours." Thorne's arm was around her waist, holding her close. "Your father left you the boarding house because he knew you could run it, not because you had to kill yourself proving it. I'm afraid if I stop pushing so hard, it will all fall apart." "It won't. Not if you're smart about it, not if you let people help you." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Not if you understand that rest isn't giving up, it's gathering strength for the next battle." Adelaide tilted her head back to look at him. The moonlight silvered his features, making him look almost unreal. "How did you get so wise? Nearly dying has a way of teaching lessons real quick." His expression was serious now. "I meant what I said before. I've been where you are, Adelaide. I pushed myself past all reasonable limits because I thought that was what strength meant. Then one winter, I got caught in a blizzard, tried to make it back to the cabin instead of finding shelter. Nearly froze to death because I was too stubborn to admit I needed to stop." "What happened?" "Woke up 3 days later, half dead from frostbite and exposure. An old trapper had found me and dragged me to his camp. Spent a month recovering, and the whole time he kept telling me the same thing. Rest isn't a sin, boy. It's survival. Took me nearly losing my life to learn that lesson." Adelaide's hand found his, fingers intertwining. "I'm glad you learned it. Glad you survived. Me too." Thorne brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "Otherwise, I never would have met you." The week ended, but Thorne didn't leave. It wasn't discussed or negotiated. He simply stayed, and Adelaide didn't ask him to go. The arrangement continued, with Thorne helping around the boarding house while Adelaide learned, slowly and with difficulty, to let go of some of her burden. It felt strange at first, almost wrong, but the results were undeniable. She had energy she hadn't felt in years. Her hands healed. The constant headache that had been her companion faded away. She started eating regular meals and sleeping through the nights. More than that, she was happy. Genuinely, surprisingly happy. Thorne made her laugh with his dry humor and unexpected observations. He challenged her when she started slipping back into old patterns, gently but firmly reminding her that the world wouldn't end if she took an afternoon off. And every evening, they would find time to be alone together, talking and kissing and slowly, carefully, building something that felt like it might last. "I need to tell you something," Adelaide said one evening, about 2 months after Thorne had first arrived. They were sitting on the porch, as had become their habit, but tonight felt different, heavier somehow. "I'm listening." Adelaide took a breath, gathering courage. "The boarding house is mortgaged heavily. My father borrowed money to expand it right before he died, and I've been barely keeping up with the payments. I've got about 6 months before the bank can foreclose if I can't come up with the balance." Thorne was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "How much do you need?" $500. The number felt impossible, a mountain too high to climb. "I've been saving every penny I can, but it's not enough. Even with you helping, even with the money I'm saving on food and repairs, I won't make it." "Then we'll find another way." Adelaide blinked at him. We. Thorne's arm tightened around her. "You think I'm going to let you face this alone? Let the bank take your home without a fight? Thorne, this isn't your problem. It is if I'm planning to spend the rest of my life here." He turned to face her fully, his expression intense in the moonlight. "I love you, Adelaide. Been in love with you since about the third day I was here, when you tried to carry 2 full water buckets while simultaneously stirring a pot and reading a letter from the bank. You're the most stubborn, determined, beautiful woman I've ever met, and I'm not going anywhere. Adelaide's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. You love me, with everything I am. Thorne's hand cupped her face. I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a couple months, but I spent 5 years alone in the mountains and I know what loneliness feels like. This isn't that. This is coming home. Tears spilled down Adelaide's cheeks, but for once they were happy tears. I love you too. I was afraid to say it, afraid you'd leave if I needed too much or asked for too much. Adelaide Lancaster, you could never ask for too much. Thorne kissed her softly, tasting the salt of her tears. I want to marry you, want to help you save this boarding house and build a life here. If you'll have me. Yes, the word burst out of her, fierce and certain. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it. Thorne's smile was brilliant, transforming his usually serious face into something almost boyish. He stood, pulling Adelaide to her feet and spun her around until she was laughing and dizzy. When he set her down, he kissed her again, deeper this time, full of promise and passion and barely restrained need. We'll figure out the money, he said when they finally broke apart. I've got some saved from selling furs. It's not 500, but it's a start. And I've been thinking about starting a guide service, taking people up into the mountains for hunting trips. There's money in that, especially with all the wealthy folks coming out here looking for adventure. Hope, that dangerous and wonderful thing, bloomed in Adelaide's chest. You really think we can save it? I think we can do anything if we're together. Thorne pulled her close again, and Adelaide rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. But first thing tomorrow, we're going to see about getting married. I'm not waiting another day to make you mine properly. Adelaide laughed. What happened to taking things slow? 5 years in the mountains taught me that when you find something worth keeping, you hold on tight and don't let go. His lips brushed her forehead. You're worth keeping, Adelaide. They were married 3 days later by the circuit judge who came through Pyramid City once a month. The ceremony was simple, held in the boarding house parlor with the boarders as witnesses. Adelaide wore her mother's dress, carefully preserved and only slightly yellowed with age. Thorne had gotten a haircut and looked uncomfortable in a borrowed suit jacket, but his eyes never left her face as they spoke their vows. Mrs. Patterson cried throughout the ceremony. Mr. Morrison produced a surprisingly good bottle of whiskey for a toast. Even Mr. Chen smiled and offered his congratulations in his quiet way. The celebration was modest but heartfelt, and Adelaide found herself overwhelmed by how much her life had changed in such a short time. That night, alone in Adelaide's small room, Thorne undressed her with patient care, his hands gentle despite their roughness. He traced the scars on her palms from years of hard work, kissing each one as if they were precious. Adelaide had thought she might be nervous, but with Thorne, everything felt natural. Right. When he made love to her, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes and a passion that set her blood on fire. Afterwards, wrapped in his arms, Adelaide felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace, complete and utter peace. No regrets, Thorne asked, his fingers trailing lazy patterns on her back. Not a single one. Adelaide pressed a kiss to his chest. You. Only that I didn't find you sooner. He pulled the blanket over them both. Rest now. Tomorrow we start working on saving this place. Adelaide closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come immediately. Her mind was too full of plans and possibilities. Thorne, thank you. For what? For teaching me that rest isn't a sin. For showing me I don't have to carry everything alone. She tilted her head back to look at him. For loving me, Thorne's kiss was soft, sweet, full of emotion that didn't need words. Always, Adelaide, always. The next morning, they began implementing their plan to save the boarding house. Thorne put out word about his guide services, leveraging contacts he'd made over the years. To Adelaide's surprise, there was immediate interest. Wealthy men from back east were willing to pay handsomely for an experienced guide to take them into the mountains for hunting and fishing expeditions. Thorne's first client, a banker from San Francisco, paid $50 for a week-long trip. While Thorne was gone on that first expedition, Adelaide kept the boarding house running, but with a crucial difference. She knew when to stop, knew when to ask Mrs. Patterson for help with the mending, or when to let Mr. Morrison chop the firewood he kept offering to handle. She took breaks, ate regular meals, and went to bed at reasonable hours. And every night, she looked at the empty space beside her and missed her husband with an ache that was both painful and wonderful. Thorne returned a week later with stories of the trip and more money than Adelaide had expected. The banker had been so pleased he'd given Thorne an extra $20 and promised to recommend his services to friends. Between Thorne's earnings from the guide service and Adelaide's continued income from the boarding house, they began making real progress on the mortgage debt. The months that followed were the happiest of Adelaide's life. She and Thorne fell into a pattern that worked for both of them. When he was home, they worked together on the boarding house, but Adelaide no longer pushed herself to exhaustion. When Thorne was away on guiding trips, Adelaide managed the boarding house with help from the boarders, who had become more like family than paying guests. She learned to delegate, to accept help, to understand that her worth wasn't measured by how much she could accomplish in a day. The boarding house began to thrive in ways it never had before. Word spread about the good food and welcoming atmosphere, and Adelaide found herself turning away potential boarders because all her rooms were full. She started charging slightly more, reinvesting the profits into improvements. Thorne built additional rooms onto the back of the house during the winter months when guiding work was slow. By the time spring arrived, the boarding house had doubled in capacity. Adelaide stood on the front porch one April morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains and marveling at how different she felt compared to a year ago. She had gained weight, filling out the hollows that had made her look skeletal. Her hands had healed, the cracks and bleeding a distant memory. Most importantly, the bone-deep exhaustion that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a vitality she hadn't known she could feel. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and Adelaide leaned back against Thorne's chest with a contented sigh. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his chin resting on top of her head. "How much has changed? How different everything is now? Better or worse? Infinitely better." Adelaide turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had become her everything. "I keep thinking about that first day when you told me rest wasn't a sin. I was so angry at you." Thorne's smile was gentle. "I know, you looked like you wanted to hit me with that hammer." "I did want to hit you. You were this stranger telling me how to live my life." Adelaide's hands came up to rest against his chest. "I thought you didn't understand, that you couldn't possibly know what it was like to carry the weight I was carrying. But I did understand. Just took you a while to believe me." "You saved my life, Thorne. If you hadn't come along when you did, I really would have worked myself to death." The admission came easily now, without shame or defensiveness. "I couldn't see it then, but you were exactly what I needed. We saved each other." Thorne's kiss was soft, lingering. "I was living half a life in those mountains, telling myself solitude was what I wanted. Then I saw you, and I knew. I was meant to be here with you." Adelaide kissed him back, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, she had news to share, news that would change everything once again. "I went to see Doc Harrison yesterday," she said, watching Thorne's face carefully. Concern flickered across his features. "Are you all right? Are you sick?" "No, I'm not sick." Adelaide took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I'm pregnant." Thorne froze, his eyes going wide. "Pregnant? You're sure? Doc says about 3 months along. I should have realized sooner, but with everything else happening, I didn't notice the signs." Adelaide bit her lip, suddenly nervous. They had never really discussed children, too focused on saving the boarding house. "Are you happy?" For answer, Thorne let out a whoop that probably woke half the boarders, then lifted Adelaide off her feet and spun her around. His laughter was rich and full of joy, and when he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He cupped her face in his hands, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "A baby. We're going to have a baby. You're not worried?" "About the money, about the boarding house, about Adelaide." Thorne's voice was firm. "We've paid off the mortgage. The boarding house is thriving. We have savings for the first time in years. And even if none of that was true, I'd still be the happiest man alive right now." His hand returned to her stomach, resting there with reverent care. "This is everything I didn't know I wanted." Adelaide felt tears spill over, but they were happy tears, the kind that came from a heart too full to contain all the emotion. "I love you so much." "I love you too. Both of you." Thorne's smile was radiant. "Though we might need to add on another room, can't have the baby staying with the boarders." Adelaide laughed through her tears. "Always so practical. Someone has to be. You're too busy being beautiful and perfect and carrying my child." He kissed her again, soft and sweet. "When's the baby due?" "Doc says October, probably early in the month." "October." Thorne's expression grew distant, calculating. "That gives us plenty of time to prepare. I'll need to cut back on the guiding trips, especially toward the end. Maybe take on a partner, someone who can handle some of the work." "We'll figure it out," Adelaide said, echoing the words he had spoken to her so many times. "Together." "Together," Thorne agreed. The pregnancy was easier than Adelaide had feared, though Thorne fussed over her constantly. He insisted she cut back her hours even more, taking on an increasing share of the boarding house work. Adelaide protested at first, but Thorne was immovable on the subject. "You're growing a whole person inside you," he said when she complained about him doing the heavy lifting. "That's work enough. Women have been having babies and working for thousands of years," Adelaide pointed out. "And you worked yourself nearly to death before I met you, so forgive me if I'm a little protective now." His hand rested on her growing belly, which had become his favorite place to touch. "Besides, I like taking care of you." Adelaide couldn't really argue with that, especially when taking care of her meant Thorne cooking her favorite meals and rubbing her aching feet every evening. She learned to let him pamper her, to accept care without feeling guilty about it. It was a hard lesson, but one she was finally beginning to master. The boarders were thrilled about the baby. Mrs. Patterson immediately began knitting tiny clothes in every color. Mr. Morrison carved a beautiful cradle from oak wood, spending weeks on the intricate details. Even Mr. Chen, who rarely showed emotion, pressed a small jade pendant into Adelaide's hand one day, explaining it was for protection and good fortune. "You have built a family here," Thorne observed one evening, watching Adelaide fold the tiny clothes Mrs. Patterson had completed. "Not just boarders, but real family." "I suppose I have." Adelaide hadn't thought of it that way before, but Thorne was right. These people who had started as business transactions had become something more. They celebrated together, worried together, cared for each other in the way families did. "My father would have liked that. He would have been proud of you, of everything you've accomplished." Thorne pulled her close, careful of her rounded belly. I'm proud of you. All I did was survive. That's not nothing. Survival takes strength, especially the kind you showed. His hand traced circles on her back. But you've done more than survive now. You're thriving. Building something lasting. Adelaide thought about that as autumn approached and her belly grew heavy with child. She was thriving in ways she never could have imagined that desperate day when Thorne first arrived in Pyramid City. The boarding house was successful, fully paid for and expanding. Her marriage was happy, built on mutual respect and genuine love. She had friends, family, a community that supported her. And soon she would have a child. The baby came on a cool October evening, just as Doc Harrison had predicted. The labor was long and difficult, but Adelaide had Thorne beside her the whole time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. When the baby's first cry filled the air, Adelaide felt a surge of love so powerful it took her breath away. "A boy," Doc Harrison announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant in Adelaide's arms. "Healthy lungs on him, that's for sure." Adelaide looked down at her son, this tiny perfect person she and Thorne had created, and felt her heart expand impossibly further. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be blue like his father's. His little fists waved in the air, and when Adelaide touched his palm, his fingers curled around hers with surprising strength. "He's perfect," she whispered. Thorne, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, made a choked sound. Adelaide looked up to find tears streaming down his weathered face. "Can I hold him?" She passed the baby carefully to Thorne, who cradled their son against his broad chest with surprising gentleness. The sight of this big, strong mountain man holding their tiny baby with such tender care made Adelaide's eyes fill with tears again. "Hey there, little one," Thorne said softly. "I'm your papa, and I promise you I'm going to do everything I can to give you a good life. Teach you to be strong, but also to know when to rest, to work hard but not so hard you forget to live." He looked at Adelaide, his eyes shining. "To love with everything you have, like your mama taught me." "What should we name him?" Adelaide asked. They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Thorne looked down at the baby, considering. "Thomas," he said finally. "Thomas Lancaster Garrett, after your father." Adelaide's throat tightened. Her father's name had been Thomas. She had thought Thorne might have forgotten, as she had only mentioned it a few times. But he remembered, and he wanted to honor that memory. "Thomas. I love it." Little Thomas grew quickly, thriving in the loving environment of the boarding house. He was passed from boarder to boarder, each one eager to hold him and coo over his baby smiles. Mrs. Patterson declared him the most beautiful child she had ever seen. Mr. Morrison carved him toys from scraps of wood. Mr. Chen taught him Chinese lullabies in a surprisingly good singing voice. Adelaide watched all this with a full heart, marveling at how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she had been alone and desperate, working herself to death in a futile attempt to hold onto her father's dream. Now she had a husband she loved deeply, a healthy son, a thriving business, and a community that felt like family. It seemed almost too much blessing for one person to contain. "You look thoughtful," Thorne said, coming up behind her as she stood on the porch, Thomas sleeping in her arms. "Just thinking about how lucky I am." Adelaide leaned back against him, relishing the solid warmth of his body. "How lucky we are. Luck had nothing to do with it. You earned every bit of this happiness through strength and determination and stubbornness." Thorne kissed the top of her head. "Though I admit, I feel pretty lucky myself." Thomas stirred in Adelaide's arms, making the little snuffling sounds that meant he would wake soon and demand to be fed. Adelaide looked down at him, this tiny person who represented everything she and Thorne had built together, and felt a peace so complete it was almost overwhelming. Thorne, thank you for teaching me that rest isn't a sin, for showing me I could have more than just survival. Adelaide turned her head to look at him, for loving me enough to help me save myself. Thorne's arms came around both her and Thomas, holding them close. Always, Adelaide, always. The years rolled on, bringing changes and challenges but also deep contentment. The boarding house continued to thrive, becoming one of the most respected establishments in Pyramid City. Adelaide hired additional help, young women who reminded her of her younger self, desperate and willing to work hard. She paid them fairly and insisted they take regular breaks, passing on the lessons Thorne had taught her. Thorne's guiding business grew as well. He took on 2 partners, both experienced mountain men who shared his ethics and skills. Together, they established a reputation for safe, exciting expeditions that attracted wealthy clients from across the country. The money they earned was more than enough to support the family and continue improving the boarding house. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic child who loved nothing more than following his father around the property. At 3 years old, he was already helping Thorne with simple tasks, his little face serious with concentration as he handed his father tools or tried to hammer nails under careful supervision. Adelaide would watch them together, her heart full, and marvel at the beautiful life they had created. When Thomas was 4, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with excitement rather than anxiety. They were established now, secure in ways they hadn't been before. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and in the spring of 1882, Adelaide gave birth to a daughter they named Anna, after Adelaide's mother. Anna was a quiet baby, content to observe the world with wide, serious eyes. She had Adelaide's auburn hair and Thorne's strong features, and from the beginning, she showed signs of having inherited her father's calm patience. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help care for her. "We make good babies," Thorne observed one evening, watching Thomas gently rock Anna's cradle while Adelaide prepared supper. "We make a good family," Adelaide corrected, smiling at the scene, "though I think 2 children might be enough for now." "For now," Thorne agreed, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. "But I wouldn't complain if we ended up with more. I like our house full of life and noise," Adelaide laughed. "The boarding house is already full of life and noise. Different kind of noise, better kind." He kissed her neck, the kind that comes from love. As the children grew, Adelaide made sure to teach them the lessons she had learned so painfully. They were taught the value of hard work, but also the importance of rest. They learned to help around the boarding house, but Adelaide and Thorne were careful not to burden them with too much responsibility. Childhood should be a time for play and learning, not endless labor. Thomas, at 8 years old, already showed signs of his father's affinity for the outdoors. He begged to go on guiding trips, and eventually, Thorne started taking him on short, easy expeditions. The boy would come back full of stories about deer and rabbits and the beauty of the high country, his eyes shining with excitement. Anna, at 4, was more interested in the boarding house operations. She followed Adelaide around, asking endless questions about cooking and managing accounts. She had a natural head for numbers and could already add and subtract better than some adults. Adelaide had a feeling her daughter would be a formidable businesswoman someday. One evening, as the family sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas asked the question Adelaide had been waiting for. "Mama, what was it like before Papa came?" Adelaide looked at Thorne, who nodded encouragingly. Their children were old enough to understand now, old enough to learn from their mother's mistakes. It was hard, Adelaide said honestly. I was alone, trying to run the boarding house by myself. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I never stopped, I could make everything perfect, but I was wrong. What happened? Anna asked, leaning against her mother's side. I was working myself to death. I didn't eat enough or sleep enough or take care of myself at all. I thought rest was something only weak people needed, that stopping meant failure. Adelaide's hand found Thorne's, their fingers intertwining automatically. Then your papa arrived and taught me different. What did he teach you? Thomas wanted to know. That rest isn't a sin. That asking for help doesn't make you weak. That you can be strong and still need someone to lean on sometimes. Adelaide smiled at Thorne, seeing the love and understanding in his eyes. He taught me that survival isn't the same as living, and that I deserved more than just surviving. Papa saved you, Anna said with certainty. We saved each other, Thorne corrected gently. Your mama was already strong. She just needed someone to remind her that even strong people have limits, that it's okay to rest, to need help, to be human. Is that why you always make us take breaks when we're doing chores? Thomas asked. Exactly. Adelaide pulled both her children close. I don't want you to make the same mistakes I did. I want you to know that working hard is good, but working yourself to exhaustion isn't noble. It's just harmful. You're allowed to rest. You're allowed to play. You're allowed to be children. We know, Mama, Anna said, patting her mother's hand with the solemnity of a much older person. You tell us all the time. Adelaide laughed. And I'll keep telling you because it's important. Promise me you'll remember, even when you're grown. Promise me you'll take care of yourselves. We promise, both children chorused. As the years continued to pass, Adelaide watched her children grow with pride and occasional bittersweet nostalgia. Thomas became a skilled guide like his father, leading expeditions into the mountains with confidence and care. But unlike Thorne's earlier life of solitary wandering, Thomas always came home, drawn back by the warmth of family and community. At 19, he married a sweet girl from town, and they built a house just down the street from the boarding house. Anna, at 15, had indeed proven to be a business prodigy. She helped Adelaide manage the boarding house accounts and had ideas for expansion that were both ambitious and practical. She talked about maybe opening another boarding house in a different town, creating a small empire of welcoming establishments. Adelaide had no doubt her daughter would accomplish everything she set out to do. The boarding house itself had become something of a landmark in Pyramid City. People spoke of it as a place where you were treated like family, where the food was excellent and the company warm. Adelaide had created exactly what she had dreamed of all those years ago, but with the crucial difference that she hadn't destroyed herself in the process. On a warm summer evening in 1890, Adelaide and Thorne celebrated their 13th wedding anniversary. The children had taken over supper service, insisting their parents deserved a night off. Adelaide and Thorne walked out into the desert, following a familiar path to a small rise that overlooked Pyramid City. 13 years, Adelaide said, settling against Thorne's side as they sat on the sun-warmed rocks. Seems like yesterday and forever ago at the same time. Best 13 years of my life. Thorne's arm came around her shoulders. Though I'll admit, sometimes I look at you and still can't believe you married me. Why wouldn't I have married you? You're the best man I know. I was a gruff mountain man who showed up and immediately started bossing you around. Thorne's smile was self-deprecating. Not exactly a fairy tale beginning. It was exactly what I needed. Adelaide took his hand, tracing the familiar scars and calluses. You saw me when I couldn't see myself anymore. Saw that I was destroying myself and cared enough to stop me. That's better than any fairy tale." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Adelaide thought about the woman she had been 13 years ago, exhausted and desperate and so very alone. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone she could barely remember being. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Staying here, giving up your life in the mountains?" "Never." Thorne's answer was immediate and firm. "The mountains were beautiful, but they were lonely. This is better. Family is better. You are better than anything I left behind." "I love you," Adelaide said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them. "I love you too." Thorne pulled her closer, and they stayed like that as the stars began to emerge. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful together. The boarding house lights glowed in the gathering darkness, warm and welcoming. Adelaide could hear faint laughter carrying on the evening breeze, the sound of her children and the boarders enjoying each other's company. This was her life now. Not just survival, but genuine joy. Not endless work, but meaningful purpose balanced with rest and love. "Thank you," she whispered into the quiet. "For what?" Thorne asked. "For teaching me that rest isn't a sin. For showing me I deserve happiness." Adelaide looked up at him, seeing the love and contentment in his face. "For everything." Thorne kissed her softly, a promise and a celebration all at once. "Thank you for letting me. Thank you for building this life with me." As they walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, Adelaide felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible. She had learned to work hard without destroying herself. She had built a successful business while maintaining her health and happiness. She had raised children who understood the value of rest and the importance of balance. And she had found a love that sustained her through every challenge and celebrated every triumph. The woman who had once worked from dawn to dusk, believing rest was a sin, had become someone who understood that rest was necessary. That asking for help was strength, not weakness. That love and family and community were worth more than any amount of money or success. Years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable changes that time always brings. Thomas and his wife had 3 children, making Adelaide and Thorne grandparents. Anna eventually did open a second boarding house in a nearby town, managing it with the same care and attention to both business and people that she had learned from her parents. The original Pyramid City boarding house remained the family's heart, though Adelaide gradually handed over more of the daily operations to younger hands. Thorne's hair turned silver, but he remained strong and vital, still taking occasional guiding trips, though not with the frequency of his younger years. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them to fish and track and respect the wild places. Adelaide watched him with their grandchildren and fell in love with him all over again, seeing the gentle patience and deep care he showed to the next generation. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration at the boarding house. It seemed like half of Pyramid City showed up, all the people whose lives Adelaide and Thorne had touched over the years. Former boarders came back to visit, sharing stories of how Adelaide's kindness had helped them through difficult times. People Thorne had guided into the mountains spoke of his skill and integrity. Young women Adelaide had employed thanked her for giving them opportunities and teaching them to value themselves. "You've built something remarkable," the mayor said, raising his glass in a toast. "Not just a business, but a community institution. A place where people know they'll be treated with respect and care." Adelaide and Thorne Garrett have made Pyramid City a better place, and we're honored to celebrate them tonight. Adelaide looked around at the crowded room, at the smiling faces and raised glasses, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. This was so much more than she had dreamed of all those years ago when she was drowning in work and despair. This was legacy. This was meaning. This was love multiplied and reflected back in countless ways. Later, when the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet, Adelaide and Thorne sat on their porch one more time, watching the stars wheel overhead. 25 years, Adelaide mused. A quarter century. Best quarter century anyone could ask for. Thorne's hand found hers automatically, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. You know what I was thinking about today? What? That first day I saw you. You were so determined, so fierce, even though you were about to collapse. I remember thinking I'd never seen anyone so strong and so fragile at the same time. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. And I remember thinking I had to help you, even if you fought me every step of the way. I did fight you, Adelaide admitted with a laugh. I was so angry at you for suggesting I needed help. You were terrified, Thorne corrected gently. Terrified that if you stopped, everything would fall apart, that if you admitted weakness, you'd lose everything. I was, Adelaide agreed, but you showed me different. Showed me that rest isn't weakness and asking for help isn't failure. You saved my life, Thorne, not just from physical exhaustion, but from a way of thinking that would have destroyed me eventually. We saved each other, Thorne said, as he always did. I was half alive up in those mountains, telling myself I was content. Then I found you, and I learned what it meant to really live, to love, to be part of something bigger than myself. Adelaide leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and wood smoke and home. Do you think the children understand? Thomas and Anna, do you think they really learned the lessons we tried to teach them? I know they did. Look at how they live their lives. Thomas works hard but always makes time for his family. Anna built her business, but she also takes time to rest and enjoy the fruits of her labor. They found the balance we wanted for them. Thorne kissed the top of her head. We did good, Adelaide, better than good. They sat in peaceful silence, two people who had weathered decades together and emerged stronger for it. The boarding house around them was quiet now. The boarders settled for the night, but it still radiated that sense of warmth and welcome that Adelaide had worked so hard to create. I'm glad you stayed, Adelaide said softly. That first week when we made our agreement, I was so afraid you'd leave when the time was up, that I'd be alone again. I was never going to leave, Thorne said. I knew by the third day that I'd found where I belonged. Found who I was meant to be with. Nothing could have made me leave you. Not even my stubbornness, especially not your stubbornness. Thorne's voice was warm with affection. That stubbornness is part of what I love about you, the determination to keep going, to build something lasting. You just needed to learn to temper it with wisdom, to understand that you could be strong without destroying yourself. Adelaide thought about the woman she had been at 22, bleeding hands and hollow eyes, convinced that rest was a sin and weakness meant failure. That woman seemed impossibly distant now, separated not just by years but by fundamental understanding. She had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that true strength included knowing your limits. That rest was necessary for survival. That asking for help was wisdom, not weakness. I hope I've passed that on, Adelaide said. To our children, to the young women I've employed over the years, I hope I've taught them what you taught me. You have, Thorne assured her. I see it every day in how they live their lives, in the choices they make. You've created ripples, Adelaide. Changed lives in ways you probably don't even realize. As Adelaide drifted off to sleep that night, cradled in Thorne's arms as she had been for 25 years, she felt at peace. Complete. Her life hadn't been easy, but it had been rich with meaning and love. She had built something lasting, not just in terms of business but in terms of relationships and lessons passed down through generations. The years rolled on, bringing both joy and sorrow. Adelaide's hair turned silver like thorns, and her joints grew stiff on cold mornings. But she remained active and engaged, spending time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, always ready with stories about the old days and lessons about the importance of balance in life. Thorne remained her constant companion, her rock and her love. They took to spending their afternoons on the porch, watching Pyramid City grow and change around them. The silver boom had ended, but the town had survived, transforming into a stable community rather than a transient mining camp. The boarding house, now run primarily by Anna and her family, remained a cornerstone of that community. On a cool autumn evening in 1902, 27 years after they had first met, Adelaide and Thorne sat on their porch watching the sunset. Adelaide was 74 now, Thorne 76, and they moved a bit slower than they once had. But the love between them burned as bright as ever, perhaps even brighter for having weathered so many seasons together. "You remember what you told me that first day?" Adelaide asked, her hand in Thorne's. "About rest not being a sin." "I remember everything about that first day," Thorne replied, "including how much you wanted to hit me with that hammer." Adelaide laughed, the sound a bit rustier than it once had been but no less genuine. "I did want to hit you. You were this stranger telling me things I didn't want to hear. Sometimes we need strangers to tell us truth we can't see ourselves." Thorne squeezed her hand gently. "But you listened. You let me help. That took courage, Adelaide." "It took desperation," Adelaide corrected. "I was at the end of my rope." "Maybe. But you could have kept refusing help until you broke completely. Instead, you found the strength to accept it. That's courage in my book." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the play of light across the desert landscape they both loved. Adelaide thought about all the years, all the changes, all the joys and sorrows they had weathered together. She thought about their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, each one carrying forward the lessons about work and rest, strength and wisdom. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Thorne asked, though his smile suggested he knew. "For everything. For saving me, for loving me, for building this life with me." Adelaide turned to look at him, seeing the same winter sky eyes that had captivated her all those years ago. "For teaching me that rest isn't a sin." "Thank you for letting me," Thorne replied. "For opening your heart to a gruff mountain man who didn't know the first thing about courting a lady. For building a family with me. For showing me what it means to really live." As the sun slipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Adelaide leaned against Thorne's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. This was peace. This was contentment. This was a life well lived, rich with love and purpose, and lessons learned through both hardship and joy. The boarding house lights came on behind them, warm and welcoming as they had been for decades. Through the windows, Adelaide could see her family gathering for supper, multiple generations coming together the way they did every Sunday. Thomas was there with his wife and grown children. Anna had come up from her boarding house with her family. The great-grandchildren ran around playing, their laughter floating on the evening air. "We did good," Adelaide said, echoing Thorne's words from years before. "Better than good," Thorne agreed. "We built something that will last long after we're gone. A legacy of love and hard work tempered with wisdom, of strength balanced with rest, of understanding that we're human with limits and needs, and that's not just okay, it's beautiful." Adelaide closed her eyes, breathing in the desert air and the scent of coming dinner and the familiar warmth of Thorne beside her. She had learned so much over the years. That rest was necessary, not sinful. That asking for help was strength. That love and family were worth more than any amount of money or success. That you could work hard and still take care of yourself. That balance was possible, even necessary for a life well lived. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Thorne replied. "Always have, always will." As they rose to join their family for supper, Adelaide took one last look at the desert sunset, at the town they had helped build, at the boarding house that had been her burden and then her joy. She thought about the woman she had been, working herself to death in the belief that rest was a sin. And she was grateful, so deeply grateful, for the mountain man who had taught her different, who had showed her that strength included knowing when to rest, that wisdom meant understanding your limits, and that love was the most important work of all. The boarding house welcomed them inside, full of warmth and light and the voices of family. Adelaide squeezed Thorne's hand as they crossed the threshold together, just as they had done for 27 years, just as they would continue to do for whatever time remained to them. Together, they had built a life of meaning and love, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And in that moment, surrounded by family in the home they had built together, Adelaide knew with absolute certainty that she had learned the most important lesson of all. That rest wasn't a sin, but a sacred thing, a necessary thing, a thing that made all the hard work worthwhile. She had survived exhaustion and despair to find joy and purpose. She had learned to balance work with rest, strength with vulnerability, independence with partnership. And in learning those lessons, she had found not just survival, but true, deep, lasting happiness. The story of the woman who worked from dawn to dusk had become the story of a woman who learned to live fully, to love deeply, and to rest without guilt. And that, Adelaide thought as she took her seat at the family table, was the best possible ending she could have imagined.